Hello, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon, and I'm one of the co-owners and managing directors with Impetus Digital. I'm also the Toronto lead for the Transformative Technology community. So at Impetus, we believe that everything starts with a question, and then from a question comes a thought, and then a courageous conversation. We have built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration tools so that we can actually have these courageous conversations on topics, ideas, and thoughts that are truly going to help to positively disrupt healthcare. And in the neurotech space, et cetera, we're dealing with very robust questions. We're in a day and an age of tumult and of opportunity. And so what better way than to use a platform like the Impetus Insight platform to have these engaging conversations to truly move the needle on healthcare today. So I've been running a series or a masterclass on systems innovation. And this is actually the fourth class or session 4 of a series of topics that we've been looking at systems instead of just looking at particular parts in a system to help solve difficult and complex problems. So at the beginning of this discussion, everything starts with something that we all oftentimes feel like we have to run away from. And that is from a feeling of discontent. We probably have never been in a day and age where we've been feeling more discontent than we probably have in today's age with everything that is going on in the world around us. But always remember, in disconnect or discontent, it is actually the mother of all change and innovation. Just like we're seeing rocks rubbing against each other, under the incredible heat and fusion and tension of that process, we can create something as valuable and beautiful as a diamond. And so there actually is a silver lining behind all of the crazy things that are going on in the world around us today. And so we have to always remember that in amidst tensions and the conflicts that we see and find ourselves surrounded by, it is a wonderful way for us to create and to be able to solve issues that have always been pending or that we always have set aside for another day to help solve. Right now, because everything is front and center, and this confluence or in this tornado of events, there's no better time for us to stare straight away at the white elephants in the room and to come up with a systematic way of approaching these problems. However, to emerge from this place of cognitive dissonance, and cognitive dissonance is when we feel out of sorts between our belief systems, what we do in our day-to-day, how we actually manage and handle and sustain our lifestyles with the activities and the thoughts and the belief systems of the world and the people that surround us. That actually creates a level of ambiguity and of dissonance that makes us, for the most part as human beings, very uncomfortable. So oftentimes we have to come up with narratives or stories to help fill in the gap. And unfortunately, this is actually oftentimes called confirmational bias. Just like we've talked about a lot of computer algorithms riddled with bias, we as human beings, based on the very neural circuitry of the way our brains work and the way they actually function to be able to provide efficient memorization and abilities to create automaticity in the way we live, breathe, work, etc., is we have actually conformed to certain ways of thinking. And so when we see something that's out of sorts or creates cognitive dissonance, we'll latch onto previous neural networks, things that we have already become automatic, and other ways of thinking, and try to piece things together to create a belief system or to come up with what we call comforting lies. So we create and tell ourselves stories so that we can create some comment, we can make some sense out of the nonsensical or what they actually oftentimes call a world that is just irresistibly dissonant or that just doesn't make any sense. So what we sometimes find is in this process of gap filling, to gap fill the cognitive dissonance, is we can get into a contradiction. We can get into a place where on the one hand, we can see the ideal, But at the other hand, there's also a reality. There's a reality in which we live in. And we have to sort of find that commonality or the common truth. Because the fact is, I really believe that truth is a bit subjective. I really believe that everybody has their own somewhat version of reality based on their own belief systems, their histories, their own automatic neural networks, things that they have been exposed to or not exposed to, and the people that they surround themselves with. All of that actually creates their own reality. So when we actually multiply our reality with the billions of people that live in the world, you are ideally going to create this gap or this dissonance and some illusions and some narrative telling between what you are ideally trying to create and build for yourself with what is really going on around you based on other people's sensibilities and sense of reality. But really understanding that through that gap filling and that narrative telling and that storytelling and of the path to finding your truth is there's pain and there's tension. And just like I was mentioning the metaphor of the diamond creation, the same thing exists for the development of muscle. We oftentimes, when we're carrying something heavy, like again, the story of Sisyphus, who is pushing the stone up the hill in a never-ending process, is we are actually building muscle. Through the tears in the muscle, we're building strength and we're building volume. And there is a progression in the process. Even though at the moment we feel the tear, we feel that agony, we feel the lactic acid buildup, and we don't really realize that in the long run, there's something positive and progressive happening in the process. So as I was mentioning, the world has become more complex than ever before. When we actually started off with traditional sort of complicated problems, perhaps in the 1900s, in the Industrial Revolution, and then in the 50s, where people started moving into the suburbs and everybody was kind of working in a factory, maybe working in a blue collar space with a few white collar. Advanced education was still relatively new. Things were complicated, but they weren't as complex as they are today, where we're now starting to face all sorts of issues that are kind of merging in an ugly head on, and merging that again with issues around replacement by technology and digitization and what this means for the world. So we're now getting into what we call wicked problems. And when we start to face wicked problems head on, we can sometimes feel completely overwhelmed. So some of you might have actually heard some of the statistics of, the percentage of young people who are less than 24 years old. About 60% since the COVID-19 pandemic have had a thought or concerns or even have considered the idea of ending their life. So wicked problems being faced head on, social unrest, economic upheaval, climate changes and real ramifications, everything from gigantic locusts in Southeast, in Asia or in Southeast Africa, to wildfires that are going on in California, and then everything in between has created this global pandemic of wicked problem of creation and of problem solving. So as I was mentioning, we do oftentimes revert to this confirmational bias because we have to latch on to something that's practical. We can't live in an abstraction. It is difficult for us to get up in a day-to-day and sort of live in a meditative state without living practically in a functional way. So again, sometimes it comes down to choosing a reassuring lie. So something that we've been posing over and over in our head because it's what we truly believe and it's what's worked for us in the past, instead of sometimes facing an inconvenient truth. So it's really the idea of exuberant irrational thinking, or the rational irrationality of all human beings and the things that we oftentimes find ourselves doing. So as I was mentioning, because we're trying to get out of the abstraction, we have to create mental models of what this new world, the new normal, the post-COVID world looks like. Every one of us is reaching out for some sort of resurgence or reassurance in a world where there isn't an opportunity for complete 100% risk mitigation. We are looking to algorithms, we're looking to machines, we're looking to digital units and algorithms and automations to help come up with predictive analytics. At the end of the day, there's an infinite number of possibilities of what could happen. And truly, at the end of the day, with the things that truly matter around love and people and consciousness and what it means to be human, those things aren't necessarily very predictive, or we can't necessarily come up with the most robust algorithms that are going to help us to determine what is truly going to be the mental model of the future. So at best, we're going to come up with more theories and questions than we're going to come up with solutions. But always remembering that in the mental model making is we have to start off with something. We have to start off with protests. And these actually start off with feeling uncomfortable. We have to feel the tension and the conflict. This gets us to ask the courageous questions. It gets us to start working and thinking and doing some common sensing, and merging with other like-minded individuals or with other people who have diverse thinking to start problem solving in a systematic innovation methodology. Now, when we start coming up with these theories or these mental models, it starts to help us to broaden our perspectives beyond what is currently known in our own mental space. So when we open the door, when we start to ask questions, when we start to invite other people's diverse opinions, suddenly we are going into the Johari window of, I didn't know that I didn't know that. It suddenly illuminates in this surreal place in the universe of all of these hidden treasures of knowledge and truth making that were never seen by us before in our own reality. But innovation requires that the system goes beyond individual parts. So if we just look at an individual part, we oftentimes can't look at the bigger picture. You probably often have heard of that cliche that, you can't see the forest for the trees. When you're right in the middle of these little problems that you're looking at, you can't see the forest. You can't see the big picture. So it really takes a different skill set and a different series of questions to be able to float very seamlessly between the 4,000 or the 40,000 foot view, the big systematic innovations thinking perspective, and then being able to drill down into the minutia, what I would oftentimes call the fluctuation between convergent, sort of really baseline thinking, and then the divergent, whimsical, open sensical thinking. So divergent and divergent thinking, and being able to ebb and flow into to allow for innovative thinking, going between the parts and the systems. We also have to understand that sometimes the systems thinking can pervade us because it's so complex. It is such a wicked problem. I'm thinking right now about what baffles us now with trying to solve the issues around the medical system and the healthcare system. How do we make sure that healthcare is accessible to everybody? How do we make sure that people have access to drugs? Right now, while we're trying to solve the COVID-19 vaccine issue, how do we manufacture it? How do we get testing done quickly and efficiently? And then when the COVID-19 vaccine becomes available, how does it get manufactured? How does it get delivered? And how do we educate people so they actually want to do and get the vaccine? So there's numerous different things in the complexity of that. And that is really just one pandemic. It doesn't solve all the other issues that are going to be upcoming around pandemics to come. And what does this look like? And how do we protect ourselves? And how do we predict these things? And on it goes. So sometimes the expansiveness of these systems can pervade us from even asking the right questions or even being able to understand what the individual components or parts are. So we do have to rely to a certain degree on some of our subjective interpretations, but with those, we also can get ourselves to believe that we are actually the change agents in this opportunity. So we always have to keep it real. And I think a big part of this is the diversity in thinking. We have to ensure we're not just surrounding ourselves with the same people, with the same ideas. And again, unfortunately, some of the algorithmic ways that things like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, all these other social media channels, they continue to get us to face the same ideas so that we're not being challenged by other people who are thinking differently. And so we need to be very cognitive of what Daniel Kahneman calls, slow and fast confirmational bias, and the myriad of ways that we tell ourselves the narratives and the stories that get us to believe that we are the change agents, that we know what we're talking about, and that everybody else is wrong. So just like in a very similar way, so just using this as a case in point, when we've actually, for example, politicized the idea of mask wearing during the COVID-19 pandemic. You can talk about, right or left wing, who's wearing masks versus not. And so everybody thinking that depending on who you sit on that line, that you are the people who are right. And of course, keeping in mind that everybody is vying for authority. So as we are approaching a pending, election that's going on in the US, and there's going to be lots of different elections across the globe, everybody is vying for authority. And they're leveraging this ability to be the change agent, to be the right one, to be the bearers of all truth, to this unidimensional solutions without necessarily looking at the holistic approach from the entire system's way of looking at the problems. So we need a lot more objective metrics. And a good case in point was what brought us into this COVID-19 pandemic from the beginning. We have relied on traditional metrics of measuring the sustainability and the effectiveness of economies up to this date using things like GDP. We have used a whole assortment of other metrics around efficiencies. These are all sorts of accounting terms, profits, how to do something with the least amount of time, with the most amount of profit. These are the ways we run companies, the way we run countries, until we hit COVID-19. And then we realized that some other key parameters and metrics, such as resilience and risk mitigation, these things don't actually hit profit and loss statements. They need entirely new economic models to be able to start measuring these. How do we measure happiness factors? How do we measure the quality of life of the baseline citizens of specific economies and countries? How do you evaluate the efficiency and the resiliency of an economy that uses, for example, universal basic income to be able to maintain a certain echelon and level of living standards? So all of these things are coming in to replace subjectivity with being reflexive, being able to be nimble, and to be able to have all bases covered so that we can actually mitigate issues that we couldn't necessarily predict in advance. So there is multiple ways to look at the truth, and the fact is they're all true, but we just need to mitigate based on when any and all of these may show up in our reality. So all of this is an activity of balancing between analytical reductionism, so the small component parts of what we see as being a dog, and what is the synthetic holism. So is the dog made up of some of its parts? So it's a very interesting philosophical question. So what makes up a dog? Is it just its parts? Or when the parts come together, is there something magical that happens that supersedes those individual parts? And those are the things that we're constantly exploring as communities, as countries, as global thought networks of what does this look like, and getting away from the reductionism into the holism concept. It's also an opportunity to go back and forth between differentiation and integration. No, I'm not talking about calculus here, although those terms are used in math, but we are talking about the ability to get into divergent thinking, so differentiating, thinking explosively, taking opportunities to engineer serendipity, random collisions, and then the ability to integrate, to confluence, to congregate, and to get people to sort of solidify and bake in those ideas. So the ebb and flow between differentiation and integration is an absolutely essential component to this sense making, to this development of holism and thinking in a systematic innovative way. So we need to look both at the parts and at the system concurrently. So as I was just using the dog analogy, we can look at watches, we can look at any complex system that has wicked problems. It can be healthcare, it can be our political systems, it can be a whole slew of other things that we need to have the ability to ebb and flow through confluence and through differentiation and integration. So those up and down movements through sense making to be able to help to solve both the parts and the systems problems. And we also have to understand the functions and relations. So again, another mathematical term, but the idea here is the confluence between what is truth and what you believe, and somewhere in that is knowledge. So starting off here with this concept of our first question, which is, now that we're in this COVID-19 pandemic and this so-called new normal, is we need to understand what some of the underlying issues are. And so there's a whole slew of different things that we could talk about here at a systems level. As I was mentioning, we are facing all kinds of issues at an economic level. We are reaching gigantic issues around debts and deficits that are going to only do things like increasing taxes over the long term and disadvantaging our next generation to be paying for all of this in the years to come. What does that look like? We're also asking big questions as we start to meet trade wars between the US and China. We also start to see all of this around social inequality and the haves and the have-nots, the division between what's going on in Wall Street and what's happening on Main Street. Although we've seen recently, ebbs and flows and corrections in the stock market, for the most part, while there was gigantic and huge unemployment, especially in the service, in the commercial, and the retail business, the stock market was going through the roof. Mind you, most of the NASDAQ was with the FANG or the high-tech stocks that was really driving it, but still there's a disconnect. There's a social inequality to all of this element, and we've seen a lot of this through the political instability, civil uprisings, and some of the pandemic divisiveness that has been happening as a result. People are frustrated. There's a sense of social isolation. And this is one big, gigantic global experiment to determine the effects long-term on people's preparedness, their mental stability, and the effect that this may eventually have on mental health conditions, addictions, all sorts of other health issues, etc. So this is a big, giant experiment that we're all having to try to sort as a gigantic, wicked problem. In amidst all of this is fear of cancel culture, conspiracy theories, fake news. People are afraid to speak the truth, especially things that are going on with specific totalitarian governments and dictators. What can be said? Are people going to flee from those countries? Are they going to be detained and sentenced to wrongful sentences? People are afraid of speaking out against the government, afraid of wearing masks or not wearing masks, of being uphanded in certain social settings, of being seen going on a vacation or going on a flight, because what does that mean about your belief system, or what part of what party you're voting for in the next election? So all of these things have created this groundswell of concern, of a wicked problem, and it's a systems that we really need to work at multiple levels, both at the parts and at the systems level, with as many diverse opinions and many conversations that we can actually procure. The next question comes down to the following entities and defining their functions. What does it mean to rebuild these functions within society? So the questions around what is government? Many people have actually been really concerned about some of the democratic governments becoming overly bulging, overly, purchasing private companies, all of the rescue money that has been coming in, and the insurgents, and the money that has been helping to solve problems both at the corporate level as well as the insurgents for money that is going on at the individual level. So How is this helping or hindering? People are really concerned about what government should be doing or leaving the system or the economy to solve itself. Lots of questions around, social injustice. Should the government intercede? Or is this something that people just need to pan out themselves? Is that going to invite things like civil wars? Is that allowed? Should that be allowed? What does that look like? Then there's lots of questions about where industry fits in. Is industry should they work collaboratively with government? Or would that be considered collusion? There's people actually buried away somewhere in an ivory tower colluding and pricing and determining what things should cost and what people are doing. We've heard a lot of these kinds of stories happening during the Depression when a few people were owning everything. We've heard of these monopolies. There's a few people getting extremely rich while the rest of everybody is actually getting poorer over time. So it ultimately asks the question of, where does these big, for example, high-tech companies come in? Do we need to be interceding, with government of more equalization on taxation? Should there be as many tax loopholes in the taxation systems that we have? Should people be paying their fair share? Or should we be protecting the entrepreneurs of the world for the innovations, for the pharmaceutical companies, for the people who have intellectual property and being able to protect all of the hard work that they've done? These are all the controversies and the issues that are part of this complex system. And then finally, where does the consumer fit in? Especially as we start hearing a lot more about surveillance capitalism, people wearing wearables. Not only have we gone away from contact tracing where people have been downloading apps, they're now actually coming with your phone. So you actually don't even have a choice anymore. It's almost like a bad version of a Black Mirror episode. So in other countries like China, there's social tracking systems, and you get certain points for doing certain things and getting detractors for not doing others that are considered deemed the right way to live according to society. So where does that fit in? How do we actually protect our data? Is data free? Should everybody have access to it? Should consumers be able to monetize their data? Should they be able to, with their health data, through passive, seamless use of sensors in your computer or even in your TV using things like facial recognition software, be able to use things like blockchain so that you can actually determine who gathered your data and be able to get small cryptocurrency or get paid for bits of the data that people are mining in some of these data lakes? And what does that look like? Could that be the new UBI or universal basic income based on people leveraging your data? And then the other questions come down to is, how do we actually democratize a lot of what's going on? We've seen the democratization of movie production through the use of YouTubers. We've seen this with radio casting, with podcasts. And are we going to see this with manufacturing, with things like 3D printers? Where does consumers fit into the whole idea around industry? And are they just no longer going to be able to compete and just become a greater version of the feudal system that from the 1700s? The next question also has to do with the defining of the relationships between all of these entities. How does the economy work with the healthcare? As we know that healthcare is burgeoning and at the seams, as we not only increase these really expensive products for rare diseases, for oncology, for things that actually have incremental benefits, but patients want to be able to have access to these. How do we pay for these? How do we make sure that people have access without us cutting them off? How do we deal with this from an economic standpoint and balancing the budgets when there's only so much limited taxation? And now with COVID-19, we're seeing that there's potentially a repercussion in birth rates. And what is that going to look like in the long term in terms of gathering taxes to be able to pay for all of these services? Do we have a have-nots and then haves? We've seen this with the education system, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic. Wealthy parents being able to cloister their own children within pods or their own personalized teaching centers or with special tutors, while the have-nots are sending their kids in unsafe environments, non-ventilated education, schools, and facing the repercussions of potentially getting COVID-19 and passing that on to others. And last but not least, how are we fitting in the relationship with all of this within the environment? Somehow there's something to be said about, you know, our carbon footprint and the effect of global warming, lakes and water levels going up, the drowning out of certain countries, the overheating of certain other parts and states, you know, with the wildfires that are going on in the West Coast. We're seeing, you know, large amounts of insects and locusts and all kinds of things that are happening across the globe because of the environment, which is going to have an effect on pandemics in the future, which are going to have effects on our healthcare system, and then effect on our economy, and then how we're going to be eventually educating people through the process. So the complexity in our systems thinking also applies to the relationships between all of these institutions, these ideas, these concepts, and these belief systems that we have built. The homework behind this is really coming up next time when we meet on coming up with the idea of the iceberg model. We have simply touched the top of the iceberg. All of these problems, the wicked problems, the complex problems, are really the gigantic iceberg that lies underneath. And so what I really want us to be able to do as a homework assignment or as part of your thinking is, what is the wicked problem? If you were to choose one that you really think is the immense thing that you really think that we need to tease out, that we are being exposed to in society today. And then the next piece is, what component of this problem do you think is showing up as being only the tip of the iceberg? And then from that question is, what do you believe lies below? What remains unseen, untouched, and not discussed yet? And then from that, what are some of the systemic approaches that we can utilize to help create new models for problem solving and solutions to this particular iceberg model? Our next meeting is going to be on Wednesday, October 7th, same time, 11 to 12 Eastern Standard Time. We are going to talk about the iceberg model and the various leverage points that we are going to be able to tackle. I encourage and invite you to join our Facebook group on Systems Innovation for Transformative Technology Community. You can put that in the search button, and I invite you to participate. You will be able to find the slides as well as the meeting recording for this session. Thank you so much for your input. I appreciate any comments that you'll have once this is available. Have a wonderful day ahead.